Hi everyone, this is mostly the backend team, myself and Marcel, discussing the proposal about the variable restructure, which originally was formed by Furkan, but additional members had expressed interest on adding their thoughts and comments. So the purpose of the meeting is to go over the problem and the proposed solution, and maybe come to some sort of an agreement of what is the going forward plan. Furkan, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah. So I just sent the link of the document of this meeting in the Zoom, by the way. I mean, we can go step by step because it is a large epic, and I cannot just summarize all of them in one sentence. So, I mean, one of the first problems is that we say we need to introduce default variables because right now we have a top level variables and it confuses our users workflows, it confuses users, also it confuses us because the top level workflow feels like it is a pipeline variable, but it is actually a default variables for each job, because that's why we need to we are trying to introduce a default variables. And in this epic we are discussing our options, and just introducing default variables does not solve our problem, because right now we have rules to change workflow variables right now, and we don't know how to apply this default behavior for rules. So I think one of the discussions is about it, so we can start with it.
One question that I have is that, like, as a first step, and sorry for like jumping ahead, but maybe as a first step, can we just introduce this without rules and think about rules as we proceed? Or is it something that we need to agree before we even start?
I mean, I think we can introduce default variables just now, but you know, we have I think, and it is a new feature that we have workflow of rules variables, and workflow of rules variables is useful for users because they use it to change their default variables for each job. So if we just introduce default variables and if we don't provide them rules, I think I think we cannot convince people to move from top level variables to default variables. So it is our goal here. So that's why I think we need to solve this problem. I don't know.
Like my question is more toward like users would ask for rules. Okay, we can say, let's introduce default variables without rules, but I'm pretty sure that one of the first requirements be, hey, like add rules, and you know, it will bubble up, we'll get like a lot of, and eventually we'll need to add rules. And generally the question is like, I understand that the answer is yes, like yes, we can introduce the default var now and think about rules later, as a good first step.
Yeah, but one of the things that we need to decide is that we need to block people to use top level variable with the new default variable. So if we introduce default variable, we need to block people to use top level variables. So that's why, I mean, we cannot convert all people, but we can convert most of the people that use top level variables.
Yeah, I mean, I think the way to do it, and I think like blocking is like maybe, you know, persuading them to replace the top level variables with default variables is with all the challenges that they have today, like with all the challenges, and there are like many problems with, you know, parent-child and multi-project pipeline and the way they inherit those, and with the UI. So there are like, and you describe all of it really well. I think that one way, like we can do several several actions. Like first of all, obviously documentation. We need to deprecate the top level variable, and deprecate, not remove, but just deprecate and just make it disappear from our documentation. This is number one. And number two, tell all the users, hey, if you want to override your problem, here's the solution. Like use the default variable. And it will take time. But every time a user will hit this problem, we need to tell them. I mean, maybe we can even blog about it. We can post it so users will be aware. And hopefully this way, gradually we'll see users moving from the top level variables to the default variables.
So Dov, what you're saying is that if I'm using default variables and I'm including a template that I don't have a control about it, because it could be a template, GitLab template, it could be some compliance template, and they use top level variables. In my opinion, we can't raise an error, say you can't use both of them at the same time, like a static error, because that might not be in control of the user running the pipeline or the author of that pipeline. So they might need to contact the owner of the template they're including and say, can you please upgrade the configuration, otherwise I can't use mine or whatever. Maybe what thing we could do is that default variable will have a higher precedence than top level variables. So because it's a newer syntax, we document these and we will deprecate. We need to deprecate that. But like, I mean, there's two options. There is the hard option of raising an error, but that could be disruptive for people. There is the other option where one takes precedence, but we have to document that, saying that it might not make sense for a user sometimes, but like this is the path towards the deprecation. But I think we have to live with both of them, at least for a period of time.
Yeah, I think the include example is a good one. The question is like, if we make like default variables like higher precedence, does it solve the problems that we see users, with UI variables, with the pre-filled variables, because like this is the main problem that we see is about that. It's about all those problems that are appearing to users in different scenarios. And I think like Furkan's suggestion is, hey, like use this will be like the way you will be able to walk around some of those problems by simply moving it to be like a default variables. So the question is, will it solve the other problem that we see in this issue or in this epic?
Yeah, perhaps I would ask, what's the key problem? Like what are we trying to get to in the end? Because it's not clear to me how I like this idea just from a pure like understanding point, but it's still not clear to me like, well, what's the end goal? And I think it was more towards inheritance with child pipelines and things was what kind of really got us thinking a lot about that. So I'd just like to hear how it all connects.
According to me, the problem we are trying to solve is to get rid of the top level variables. It is just my opinion, because top level variables is confusing. It is like a pipeline variables, but it is actually not a pipeline variable. It is actually job variables. But sometimes we use it as a pipeline variables. For example, the prefill variables feature. So that's why it is a confusing feature of the pipelines. So our main goal, at least my main goal, is to just get rid of the top level variables and separate it to pipeline variables, or AKA workflow variables, and the default variables.
So this is the main problem here, to move away from the solution that we use for prefilled variables. Is that the way I'm seeing is that using default variables is a syntax It solves like a syntax confusion, but the behavior will remain the same. We are not adding a feature. We are making clear the syntax cleaner, right?
Yeah, I mean, we are reducing the feature actually because the top-level variables has many features, but default variables has only one feature. It is just default variables for jobs, just like other default keys. So that's why we are trying to also come up with another idea, for example, pipeline variables. Or
when you say the top-level variables has many features, what are the other features apart from the prefill?
Prefill and the default variables, that's all.
Okay, so so we want to remove the prefill. We want to move away from using top-level variables for prefill variables.
Mm-hmm.
Is that correct?
So can you repeat the question?
So we want to avoid using top-level variables for prefilling variables.
Yeah, it is one of
whether that is like a top-level variables or called default variables.
So we have another problem with the top-level variables. Right now we have a feature, workflow of rules variables, and in that feature we are trying to override top-level variables in workflow of rules variables. So that's another confusion. So I mean, yeah, there are three problems we can say.
A quick question on that one. Is the workflow rules variables a pipeline level variable? A pipeline variable?
No, it is job variables because it is top-level variables. And top-level variables means job variables.
And the pipeline variables are the ones like from the run menu, run a pipeline menu, and
trigger
the settings, schedule variables. Okay.
Yep.
There's no pipeline level variables in CI configurations.
There is only one. It is when you trigger a downstream pipeline and when you send variables to downstream, it is a pipeline variable for the downstream.
Yeah.
So the goal then is to separate. We've got multiple variables and to have two clearly defined buckets of job variables and pipeline variables. And then the goal is to have a configuration that makes it clear when you're dealing with one and you're dealing with the other.
Yep.
Okay. Just trying to verbalize it. Yeah.
Yep. But we are also, I think we are also not sure about introducing pipeline level variables in CI because I don't know if we need it or not. We don't know that. Because when you define, when you want to introduce a pipeline level variable, you can just use job level variables. Why do you use pipeline level variables, for example? But it is another discussion.
I remember one of the questions was people wanted certain variables to be passed down to the child pipeline or multi-project pipelines, or maybe it's just child pipelines by default. And then there was the discussion was, well, maybe we can do it for pipeline variables because that would be considered part of that pipeline and it should be passed on to the child. While job, it's really easy to see, well, if it's in a job, it should stay within the job. And so default variables would, again, stay within the job. And that's the confusion because you put default variables at the top level of the pipeline, it feels like it's going to go to the child pipeline, but it's not. So I like the idea of making it clear that these are default is just for jobs, and that if you do want to pass things and have like a global variable that applies to the whole parent child pipeline tree, it would be nice.
Actually, we are passing default variables to the downstream pipelines because let's think about like that. So our how we pass variables to downstream pipelines works in, when you have a YAML defined variable in the breed job, we pass it to downstream pipelines. And YAML defined variables, when you can define in many ways. You can write statically in the job itself, the breed job itself, and you can also write the default variables. And default, because we copy each of the default variables into job, and we pass them to the downstream pipelines. So actually, yeah, we will pass the default variables to the downstream pipelines.
Because the default is copied to the bridge, so the bridge gets it anyways. Gotcha.
And right now we are doing it already, by the way. I mean, the top level variables is the default variables, so we are passing to the downstream pipelines. And this is also another confusion in an issue that, I mean, they say I am defining a pipeline level variable here, but they are passed to downstream pipelines, but they don't know it is actually a job variable.
But it is passed as pipeline variable, right? It's like override.
Yes, correct.
That's the problem. Like it overrides their pipeline.
Yep. Correct.
Their variables in the jobs.
Yeah. Maybe if we introduce a pipeline variables keyword, and it will not be overridden by the upstream pipelines. So
for the downstream pipeline, introduce a pipeline variable and say, okay, this is the variable for this downstream pipeline. No one can override it.
Yep.
But I think it's probably a separate problem. I mean, it is confusing, but I think that if we will explain to them why are we doing that and what's the logic behind it, then they will understand. So, okay, next thing, please let's add like a pipeline variable. That this way we can gradually like add additional features. I think one of the problems that we have, also like another problem is, but we talk about it, it is the pre-filled variable. It becomes like you define it as a YAML variable, but when you pre-fill it in the UI, it becomes a
pipeline variable.
A pipeline variable. And I think this is one of the problems. Like the users say, hey, like this is just a variable that I'm defining.
Mm-hmm.
But the minute I will use the UI to define it, you automatically like change everything, like change the precedence. So my pipeline now works differently just because I have a nicer way to add this pipeline through the UI. So why are we doing that? And I think this is the solution that we need to provide here. At least the first one is like, let's try to come up with a way not to run over this precedence and keep variables the way they are, even if you are defining them in the UI. And the question is, can we do that with these default variables or like another keyword?
I remember Fabio has a suggestion in the Epic that let's not define a value for pre-filled variables. Let's just define a description for the variables, and we can just populate them in the pipeline new page, and they will know that it will overwrite everything. But I mean, if we allow people to write pipeline variables in CI YAML, it may feel like that you can overwrite them in the job level. So that's why I liked actually that suggestion, that we will not allow writing value for pipeline variables in the YAML file.
So if you are not, so what's the suggestion? That if you define the variable without a value, this variable through the UI will override all the variables that, because
you can explain maybe.
I was trying to pass there, but I pasted something else I had in my clipboard. So let me find out exactly where that is. Copy the link, press here. This one is. It's more like we could reuse what we currently have. We have a workflow top level keyword, and we could reuse that maybe. Well, the idea is like to use something like prompts and then var1, var2, so where those will be only descriptions that are available, but they are not actually used as to collect values, because that will be the equivalent of defining pipeline level variables, which, as I said there in the meeting agenda, there's a concern with pipeline level variables to be in a YAML, because the precedence is too high if we use as a pipeline variables as we have today, unless we introduce a new type of low priority pipeline variables that will be fitting in between those. But so there is things where some variables are set at group level or instance level, also for security or compliance perspective, and where we don't want to have a configuration to override those. But we'll still can override them like a pipeline level, but having those in the configuration could also be like a problem, because basically you're defining a pipeline of a variable that can't be overridden, right? If that's my concern, we use in the pipeline variables like in the config.
Yeah, I agree that the problem is that this is what we are doing it today, but not through the YAML configuration. We are doing it through the UI.
Yeah.
But I understand. Yeah.
So the prefill is purely a UI feature because it's not even needed for API or anything else. By API, I can specify variables that are not into our prefilled list, right? I can pass any variables by pipeline. So it's purely a UI feature. If it's a UI feature, it doesn't make sense to provide a syntax that doesn't allow a user to provide a value. So only the description, and that will be prompted there.
I just want to understand if they don't add the value in the UI, and just because right now you in the configuration file you can put a value and a description. So if they don't put it in the UI, is it a pipeline variable or a job variable?
If they don't put in the UI, it will be a job variable, right? Yeah, it will be a job variable. But if you can prefill that there in the UI, that becomes a pipeline variable. So actually that becomes like a higher level variable.
With the same configuration. So if you put like variable A and description B, and you don't do anything, it's just a job variable that gets copied throughout. And then if you then go into the UI and then you change that, it suddenly has high precedence.
Yeah.
Did not know that.
That's I think this is one of the for me it feels like a bug when we introduce this feature, but I mean
I just rewrote the documentation like 4 days ago. So I have to edit it again.
It feels like a bug, but I'm not sure if this is something we can change today because this became like an established behavior. So like, and I think this is one of the problems that we need to try to solve. Like, can we somehow define a variable in a different way that if we will populate it through the UI, it will still remain the way it was defined in the YAML? Because we are just like updating the value. Like for the user, they think, hey, there is like a way that I can prefill, that I can put a value in through the GitLab, through YAML. And hey, there is a way to do it through the UI. It's the same. Like for me as a user, I don't think there is any different. Why should there be a difference? And like in terms of like, if we look at like how users will use it. So think about it. There is like a team that is creating those templates, it's templates. So this is why your example, Fabio, makes sense about the include, but it's a separate topic. So they create like this template, for instance, that is doing some sort of a deployment for AWS. And then they test it, they use it, they say it's great. Now let's make sure that the users of those templates, like all the engineers that now need to deploy, for instance, this application, will have a slick way to do it through the UI. And we'll tell them, hey, like if you want to define it to, I know, in this way, just add those parameters in the UI. If you want like another way, add those variables, the value of the variables to the UI. But the minute they do that, the entire behavior of the pipeline is changing. And they're saying, hey, it's a bug. I mean, I just defined it, I tested, it worked. I told to all my engineers, hey, do it through the UI. There is a really nice way to do that. And suddenly everything breaks.
I think the expectation, just to make sure, again, from my understanding of it, though I haven't spoken to anyone who has ever used it in production, is that the UI variables is generally to change the behavior of your pipeline. Like it's not to configure it as per normal, like you wouldn't put in your username and password every time as a variable, but you would have a pipeline that runs again and again. And then you're like, you know what, I want to test this pipeline on a different deployment or some other thing, and I'm going to drop it in. So the expectation is that pipeline variables or like UI variables would always override the whatever defaults you have. So
they will override, but not the. I don't think the precedence needs to be override. That's the thing. Like you cannot make them like higher precedence than what they were when you define them.
But I think there it's also probably we used the existing pipeline variable form in the create pipeline variable form to inject this new pipeline, user-defined pipeline. So if when you click on run pipeline and you are redirected to this new form, we had even before the ability to say, I want to insert manually this variable. Now, what we did, and those were pipeline variables, they were being applied to the entire pipeline. But we reuse the same form to say, okay, now we can display more inputs based on the configuration. So if we use the same input, then those will become pipeline variables. It's a kind of a consequence of the tool that we used as well. So if you want to say that, okay, this job uses this variable, but I want to expose to the UI, so somebody can specify more like a variable as this job runs. So it's more like a variable that is inputted by the user by the UI, but should be applied only at job level. It sounds like it's more like this, right? To say, so maybe we'll have like a list of jobs. With some of these jobs, you can have some variables, and you can specify the variable for these jobs, and say, yeah, AWS token only for the deploy job, and it will not be a AWS token that is actually applied to the entire pipeline. So or every job will have that available. So we used one tool that probably was too powerful.
Yeah, probably, and probably as a shortcut because we already had it on the pipeline. Yeah,
yes,
we had it on the pipeline. We said let's use it the same thing. Let's use it on the on a job, but suddenly we gave him. Yeah, it was too powerful. I wonder if like one way of solving it is actually if you do it through the UI, is actually go to the UI. And when you mention a variable, you can define if it's like a pipeline variable or a job level variable. Pipeline variable is the default. So this is how it works today. But at least in order not to introduce breaking changes, you can say, hi, like, I want to change the type of this variable to be like a, not be like a pipeline variable.
So even the proposal that I suggested for kind of like the workflow prompts with vars, it might solve the problem where we have like a separate list that is dedicated for being considered as a pipeline input, but will still be a pipeline variables. We will turn whatever input has been filled by the user into pipeline variables. So my question now is like is pipeline variables the right level to be used for this kind of inputs? Look, I'm not sure about what customer were experiencing as problems. Do they consider that if they input something that was specified in a job with a description, and they input the same variable on the pipeline form, was that considered too powerful of a variable? Because then it was being exposed to all the jobs, not just the specific job where that input was required. Was this like a problem that we had seen? Because I'm not sure whether now is the pre-filled variables is too powerful because it makes them as a pipeline variables, while it should probably be like job variables.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen them. So we've seen several problems. Some of them could be addressed by defaulting users to use the default variable. So like user didn't understood that when you define variable as a top level keyword, it copied basically all the variable to a job. And if it is copied to a trigger job, and it is passing to a child pipe. But that's an expected behavior, although also when we move it to a downstream pipeline, it becomes like a pipeline variable, which is a problem by itself. But I think that we can explain why we're doing it, and maybe we can differentiate between parent child. Like we have some wiggle room here and say, okay, for like multi-project pipeline, we don't do that. And for parent child pipeline, we do that because this is the parent, this is the child, this is inheriting everything. So, and I think we have also the inherent keyword where we can define what not to pass. So like there is a way for users to somehow override that. So I think it could be not easily, but like some way alleviate this problem by using the default variables, maybe also add some examples in the documentation. This is number one, okay? We can do that, I think, even today. And then we can talk about what should we do with rules and everything. We can discuss about it later. The biggest problem that I'm seeing is that the fact that we took like the pipeline variable for the run pipeline feature, and we reuse it for running a manual job, for instance, not a manual, just like running a job and adding the pipeline to that. And we are going to enhance this feature. Actually, we want to allow user to rerun like a manual and not manual job by adding more variables. So we have like an epic for that. So it means that we need to get it right, because if not, we will basically like screw up their entire pipelines when we do that. And I think this was not an expected behavior. And if I define a variable in a job and it's like, and this is the type of the variable, we should not change the precedence simply because the way we input it, because now we have like another way to input this variable. So I would say, I think this is like, we've seen users, I can dig through and I see this confusion emerging from the problem. Like why is it overriding everything? Why this variable now behave differently just because I added to the UI?
It could be that. So it could be that anything that is pre-filled variables can have a precedent that is higher than YAML variables, but lower than any. You just write like just after YAML variables, like below pipeline variables or group variables or anything like that. So it's not as powerful. So it will be equivalent to say, grab all the variables from whatever top level variables or default variables, apply those to the jobs. But then if I input the same variable by the pipeline form, replace that job level variable with this value. So if the same variable is used in multiple jobs, that will be replaced, but will not be as pipeline variable, like as high as a pipeline variable. Because that would allow, if you want to run a specific job, manual job with a specific variable that want that to have a higher precedence, it will not be overridden by the pipeline variable that was inputted in the form when the pipeline was originally executed.
But we are changing
I think we could.
But Marius, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I think we could do that because we have a database table called CI job variables in which we store job variables, the .env source. And this table has a type column, so we could store in there a new type of variable, and we could add it in the contextable module with a set precedence higher than the default YAML variables. But the only drawback here is that we have to create a record for each job. In the CI pipeline variables, we would create only one variable record, and it would be used by all the jobs. And here we have to insert one for each job, but I think it's doable.
From the user perspective, what's the benefit of the pipeline variables? Because we don't even really document the concept of pipeline variables, just we document precedence in a sense. And we just say that jobs added in the UI have more precedence than jobs added in the config file. So like, why do we, this is more a backend that I'm not really going to understand, but why do we even really have pipeline variables? Like because Fabio said it's more powerful, and then it's almost too powerful. And then when we pass a job variable to a child pipeline, it becomes a pipeline variable. Has that become too powerful in the context of the child pipeline now? So I'm a bit confused as to the benefit of the whole pipeline variable concept itself.
Does anyone wants to take this? Otherwise,
no, I mean, my understanding from the pipeline variables is that it is a flexible, so you can run a pipeline with that way, and you can run the same pipeline with that way. Also, you can trigger a child pipeline with X way, and you can trigger the same child pipeline with Y way. So that's why the pipeline variables actually useful for some cases. We don't know, maybe we don't use it at all, but I'm sure some people use it in a very different way and useful for them.
yeah, that's exactly what Furkan was saying.
So I also want to say about Fabio's idea and Mario's idea. So I mean, if we change the permission levels of pipeline, I mean, I don't think we should change the permission levels of variables. I mean, if we have some set of rules, so one rule is that when you enter a variable in the pipeline form, it will overwrite everything. So it is our set of rule. When you run a manual pipeline, it will become a job variable and it will overwrite every variable for this job. So this is our set of rules, and I think they work perfectly in itself. So I mean, because they have some set of rules and they do their job. I don't think we should change that. But I mean, I know our confusion is that we write something on the YAML, we overwrite this into UI, and it will overwrite everything. So I write something here that, I mean, how about having project level prefill variables instead of defining them in the YAML? So let's not define them in the YAML, but let's define them. Okay, we have CI/CD settings in the project and we have variables in there. Maybe we have a checkbox in some variables that, okay, I want to prompt that in the pipeline run. So we are right now migrating our prefill variables feature from YAML to project CI/CD settings. So maybe we can do that.
I think that one might be a problem if users are using different branches to have different prompts for each branch.
Yeah, correct. I mean, I don't know if people really use the prefill variables that flexible. I'm not sure about that. I don't think they will use, but if they need that, okay. But you know, we also have, I think we also have branch feature in our CI/CD settings variables, right? Do we have that? I mean, we are setting some variables to be available in some branches or not. Maybe it is just about protected branches. Maybe I don't remember very well.
I think it's about environments.
Okay. So I don't remember it very well, but I don't think users use that prefill variables that flexible, or they can just ignore them for example. I mean, they can just ignore them. I mean, because users have a CI/CD settings and they define some pre-filled variables. And when someone opens the pipeline run page, they see the pre-filled variables in them, and they can just ignore them.
Could you use rules as well in combination with that to redefine variables? So if this variable is not empty, then the rules variable becomes that new one. In the other jobs, you can use the default one, something like that.
What do you mean by rules?
So in job rules, for example, you could say if the pre-filled variable is not empty, then you could say the job variable equals the pre-filled variable, and then in the other rules you could use just like the regular variable.
I think we can use in that way, but I'm not sure if we need it, because I mean, a pre-fill rules just overrides everything, and if you say a job can override that pipeline level variable, is that your question?
Well, I just kind of was wondering if people would see some benefit to having kind of if then in a sense with variables, such that if there's to be able to, I'm probably just misunderstanding it. To me, in my head though, it seems like if you're defining pre-fill variables like without a value, for example, like one of Fabio's ideas, it's not immediately clear to me how you would make use of that, such that sometimes you do fill it and sometimes you don't fill it. Because like I would want to write a script, or for example, that says something, 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 use this variable. And it's not clear to me how I would use that, the pre-fill variable, if sometimes it's not filled. But if we use rules, I could say, well, okay, if that's filled, I want to use that one. If it's not filled, then I want to use my default one. And then I'm just kind of imagining how I would explain to people how they would use this. And like the pre-fill variables didn't seem to have any value to me at the beginning of this conversation, but slowly I'm starting to see kind of what everyone was saying, and I'm like, okay, this is starting to make a lot more sense. But how would I use this in my config is the challenge that I'm getting at now.
After seeing them in the pipeline run page, after seeing them in that form and writing a value or not, they will be pipeline variables. Regular pipeline variables. That's all. I mean, if right now, if you can use a pipeline variables in rules, you can use them. So it is not different. The only difference is that we just pre-populated in the pipeline form page. That's all.
But if I put it in my config file right now, it has a value, right? That my job can use immediately. Like the pre-fill variables have they have a value, and they have a description, and then I can choose to override that value. But in the idea of having pre-filled variables without a value, it would mean that I wouldn't be able to use those until a value is put in the UI.
Yep.
And so I'm just thinking about how I would make use of that variable in my script if it's sometimes there and sometimes not there.
Yep, just as the regular pipeline variables. Sometimes you pass a variable, sometimes you don't.
One problem that I'm realizing with my suggestion is that it's not my suggestion only, but I think it's the general problem with the pre-fill design, in my opinion, is that we are adding the description. Basically, we're using to display the fields for the variable. It's purely metadata. It doesn't add any behavior. It doesn't add anything. I mean, if I run the same pipeline by API, or it will completely ignore whatever is in the description or in workflow prompts, or so purely metadata for configuration that is used to render something like an HTML form. So consider this is not a pipeline configuration because it's, it doesn't add any configuration to the pipeline. I'm wondering whether this should actually be something that is in the project configuration to say, I want to configure my pipeline UI with this information, and you add it there, and still, well, there will still become like pipeline variables, or you can say set these as a job level variables, whatever we want to do it. But basically, it will not add anything to the pipeline configuration. Well, it's more like a UI setup. In that case, we don't need to rely on the description or workflow prompts or anything. The pipeline just simply behaves. Because I think one interesting aspect we need to maintain standard is that the same configuration should work the same way, like even if it's like via API or via schedule pipeline. Of course, there's those like source also change the structure of the pipeline, but these specific configuration keywords that we are adding don't add any configuration changes to the pipeline. So that's my main concern.
We just add it to the regular, because we have group variables and instance variables and project variables, and we've got value, we've got protected, we've got masked, we've got the environments and the description.
I'm not sure about that, like whether it should be something at that level, because or it would be more like a pipeline UI configuration where you decide, okay, I want to add a field for this, and that will that be still a pipeline variables? Maybe it's expected behavior, because eventually you still can provide the pipeline variables in the form as is today, even without having any pre-filled variables. You can still do it manually. That is more like kind of a handy feature to provide like a better UX on that. And that's why I'm saying like maybe this could be something we can provide to customize your UI, your pipeline UI. But having that as a project level variables, I'm not sure that is a good idea, because sometimes I'm not sure, but like sometimes there could be even some pipeline, some variables keys that we don't want to expose. So like only maintainers know what kind of keys are there. It's still fine to, it might still be possible to display what variables are in a job, but we might not want to expose like what keys are available, because I'm still not sure. Like I need to think like properly about that, but we don't want to kind of expose even pipeline keys that the user shouldn't be aware of.
Just the name, you mean, not the value, but just expose the existence of the name.
Yeah.
Okay.
What if that is like a default token that should be secure, but then you want to override that? Like is a user able to inspect what kind of value was there originally? I'm not sure. Like both the keys and values, but also the keys like might be a problem. Or is the precedence correct?
Put away the keys. What you just described is one of the top requests that we have from pre-filled variables. Users would like, and this is something that we may end up adding. User would like to add like what are the options that users can add to a variable, because as I mentioned, in a lot of cases there are two teams. One team that is creating the template or the pipeline, another team that runs the pipeline. The team that runs the pipeline need to pre-populate the variables in the UI, and a lot of times they don't know like how exactly they should populate it with. So one of the requirements is to add options in the YAML configuration. This is a UI variable. Option number one is, I don't know, production, staging, testing, whatever. and user will be able to select it from some sort of a drop-down in the UI. But that's, I understand like the concern about keys, but
there is some permissions problems where today only maintainers are allowed to see project level variables, for example. And if we want to use that feature to say, expose this to the UI as a pre-filled variables, then we are actually allowing any other users to see what project level variables are there, even though they might be treated differently according to the permission. But I'm wondering that is like are we using the right tool again there, or are we, is it something different?
I have two things to say about this. So one thing is that a maintainer or an owner of the project can choose what variables to be shown in the UI. That's the one thing. The other thing is that I liked your idea that it is actually a UI, the pipeline UI problem maybe. So maybe it is not about the project CI/CD settings. Maybe it is not about YAML settings. Maybe we need to have another settings for example, pipeline settings, or I don't know the name, but maybe we can do that. But I also changed my mind about having them in the project level, because and with that we are also confusing people about the permissions, because right now what is our main problem? We are writing top level variables. It is actually default variables, but when you pre-populate them, it will become pipeline variables, right? It will overwrite everything. And if we do that, the same thing in the project level variables, project level variables has a low priority, so they cannot overwrite anything in the YAML. But when we convert a project level variable into the UI, and when you overwrite them, and it will overwrite everything. So it will also initiate another permission priority problem. So that's why I changed my mind about project level. Maybe we can find we should find another solution, as Fabio said.
Okay, I think we are at time now, and I want to make sure to respect other people's time. I want to understand if we can have some sort of an action item and a follow-up. Obviously we won't agree with everything and won't find a solution for all the problems that we have today. But like, what should be our next step? Is it like introducing the default variables without rules, as you mentioned in your proposal at the beginning, and adding more, make sure that we make sure it's clear in the documentation about how UI variables now become, even if you define it as like a default variable, become pipeline variable. Should those be like the main two things that we need to start doing, and then maybe reconvene again and try to solve other problems? Because it feels that there is so much and we need to take it like step by step. What's your thoughts, everyone?
In my opinion, we could start with tackling the problem with the pre-filled variables, like outside the default variables, or solving that kind of ambiguity. But are we? What I'm learning also from this meeting is that we might have users that consider surprising the behavior that when they pre-fill a variable from the UI, that becomes a pipeline variable and is not what they expected. So once again, like even if we move the pre-filled feature for defining what labels to display in the UI from the CI configuration that we put into somewhere in the project settings, that eventually becomes a pipeline variable, because that will be prompted in the same form and the user fill in, and that becomes a pipeline variable. Are we okay with that being? Are we seeing problems with that becoming a pipeline variable being a problem, or basically, or is it okay for that kind of level of precedence?
I think
if that is okay, I think we could probably start working towards, extracting maybe the pre-filled descriptions into somewhere else.
Yeah, I'm not sure we have an answer for that. One of the problems is, again, since there are like so many problems, everything is bubbling up. you have this problem and that problem, another one. It's very hard to distinguish between the noise and the real problem. This is why my proposed next step is just like make sure things are clear. Because as Furkan mentioned, that's our rule. This is how they work. And they work fine. Is it like the right rules for our users? Maybe yes, maybe no. The problem is because those rules are not like documented well in terms of like, examples in the UI, things that we are really missing, then customers are getting surprised. Maybe it's okay, but still it's surprising to them that, when you configure something and then you add the variable to a different way, change completely everything. Maybe if it will not be surprising, then we will realize, okay, that's not such a big problem. But now it's very hard to distinguish between, the noise because of the thing that they are not aware of this, or because it really doesn't work for them. So
okay. Yeah, I
this
agree
is
that-
why I think those are the two next steps for us, at least. And just maybe then afterward, the noise will get cleared a bit, and then we can really focus on like, is it the right thing for our user, or maybe we need to think about it differently.
Yeah, I would agree to keep the current variables that are being inserted in the UI form to be as pipeline variables because it's consistent with everything else we have.
Yeah, for now, yeah, I agree.
Yeah,
I don't want to change this behavior today.
Cool.
I wrote 2 action items in the agenda, so please tell me if it makes sense or not.
Mm-hmm.
This
Yeah.
actually would resolve if we extract the pre-filled variables from the CI config, would actually avoid us using the YAML processor to list these variables. It could be listed directly from some config records we have. Yeah, I think it will be also like a nice kind of tech debt removal.
We also brought up a lot of problems in this call, and I wonder if we could kind of list what are the current issues like with variables like in one place, because we do have a bunch of different issues, and we do have the epic. Do we think we've covered all of the problems in the one epic?
I wouldn't call it problems. Maybe let's try to, because problem
challenges
that we need to solve each problem, and maybe we don't need to solve it. That's what I'm saying. Maybe this is the way it should work, but it needs to be very clear. So maybe, I don't know, some inconsistency, or no, this is not good. But we need to find some. But again, let's list like those bullets that our users are challenged with, and you can add this as an action item. I can try taking this one, and maybe if Furkan, Fabio could help me.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Okay, cool. I think we have an action items, and let's document those in the. I'll document it on the issue, and we can carry on from there. Thanks. Thank you, Furkan. Thanks everyone for joining. Bye-bye.